Welcome to Pop Psych 101,
where we, licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad,
and licensed psychologist Dr. Hayley Roberts,
break down and analyze how mental health is represented in movies, shows, books, and across the pop culture and social media landscape.
We will determine what lines up with real life and what is just pop culture fantasy.
This is Pop Psych 101. Welcome back to Pop Psych 101. I am licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad, here as always with my ghost of Christmas present, Dr. Hayley Roberts.
Hi! Boo! Hello!
Yes, a very spooky but spirited hello to you, Hayley, and we are back with another episode here, and we're doing a Christmas special, a Pop Psych 101 Christmas special.
Yay!
Because, you know, 'tis the season, and there's a wealth of plenty of Hallmark movies out there that we could have chosen from with fascinating stereotypical relationship dynamics, but we, went with something a little different, but also traditional somehow.
Yeah.
And that is Apple TV's Spirited, starring Ryan Reynolds and Will Ferrell. So we are going to get into that after the break, as usual. But to embrace the Christmas spirit, Hayley, I have to ask you, as we're watching this, obviously it brings me back to some of my favorite Christmas movies, Christmas carols and things like that. What about you? What are your go-to Christmas movies this time of year?
Yeah, the other day I was at a white elephant party and we were talking about, it seems as though there's two types of people. One are the people who rewatch all the movies that they enjoyed from their past, like the Santa Clauses and the Home Alones and like the
Yep.
White Christmases, like those kind of things. And then the other person is the one that watches all the Hallmark Lifetime kind of movies.
Like whatever's the new weird thing.
Yeah. Like the algorithm. It's a very explicit algorithm, and I am a sucker for that algorithm.
Interesting.
I love the Hallmarky type Christmas movies. I will watch them literally year round. They bring me so much joy because they're so predictable and wonderful. But I think the one that I like the most, I think it's called The Spirit of Christmas. And it's this very attractive man from the Prohibition era that gets killed on Christmas Eve, and now he haunts the house every year, and she comes to buy the house for her business, and then she runs into him and they fall in love, and then maybe he keeps living. I don't remember how it ends, but
he's a ghost?
Yes, he's a ghost. Ryan,
Okay.
believe a little bit. We had plenty of ghosts in this movie.
No, I know. Well, but like Hallmark, I tend to think of those movies as a little bit more grounded in reality. Are they together, a living person and a ghost person?
Yes, but
now I need to know what this movie is about.
It's wonderful.
Does he come back to life?
I think he does at the end. I think their love brings him back or something.
Oh, well, that's good.
Solves
That makes
the mystery of his murder.
Okay.
And so that.
Great.
It's very Susie Q. But yeah, that one I think is my favorite. But then there's another one called 27 Dates of Christmas. And basically this woman goes last minute Christmas shopping and ends up falling back and hitting her head. And she kind of has this date that with the person over and over again 27 times until it's perfect.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So love them both. I'm on board with all those very stupid ones. How about you? What's more your type?
But it sounds like there's something comforting there for you. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people will not be surprised to hear that I'm the rewatcher. I'm the traditional cozy see the things that I've seen 100 times before. My go-to ones, ironically enough, is one of the ones is the Muppet Christmas Carol. I don't know why. Something about Gonzo and Fozzie Bear and Fozzie Bear as Fozziewig, just like a warm cup of hot cocoa. I love that. I've definitely gotten into periods where I watch A Christmas Story every year. But when you have a kid, you don't realize how kind of dark A Christmas Story is, and we don't watch that with our 5, 6, or 7-year-old as she's been growing up. So then it's become she loves watching Home Alone with us, so we get really into the Home Alones.
That's fun.
And then I'm also a sucker for like the really old like claymation or
like
stop motion, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed
yeah.
Reindeer. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's very like the old, remember ABC Families, like 25 Days of Christmas or whatever? That's kind of what you're talking about.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that was all my stuff. Both Grinches, like actually I should say all three Grinches. So the original cartoon Grinch is great and short and sweet.
Yeah.
Jim Carrey's Grinch is like a little dark, but also very good. And then the most recent animated Grinch is great.
I don't know that
if you haven't seen that one. Benedict Cumberbatch is the voice of the Grinch, and it is really good.
I have not seen that one. Okay.
And Hayley, it's even especially good for us because they do like a Grinch origin story, and naturally he's got like childhood trauma that what made him into the Grinch.
Maybe that's what we do next year for our Christmas special. Okay.
All right, sounds good. But yeah, I mean, it's there's no wrong way to do it. I think, you find what makes you happy and what makes you comfortable and bring you through the holidays.
Yeah, it can be a hard season, so just find the fun stuff.
Absolutely. No judgment here. Whatever gets you through, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's plenty of time for trying to change and New Year's resolutions and all those sorts of things, as we're going to get into right after this break with Spirited.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, Ryan here. No ad this week, but a quick request. We would love to know where you follow us, so if you wouldn't mind taking 10 seconds while you're listening to today's episode, reach out to us on your social media of choice. Say hi, say what's up, request an episode topic. We would love to hear from you. And now, back to the episode. Pop Psych 101 discusses mental health as it is portrayed in pop culture media, and because of this, we often cover sensitive topics that can be triggering for some listeners.
We also delve into the characters and plots of these stories, and therefore, spoilers abound.
So please, use your discretion as you listen to the rest of the episode.
Spirited is a 2022 American Christmas-themed musical comedy film directed by Sean Anders and starring Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds. A Christmas Carol it's obviously a modern adaptation. And the story is the ghost of Christmas Present, played by Will Ferrell, is nearing retirement, which would mean a return to Earth. He sets his sights on an unredeemable man who may end up helping the ghost come to terms with his own past. What a nice it's funny because I remember seeing trailers for this and being like, oh, that could be good. It seems like a very convoluted sort of like way to do this, but hey, I mean, starring Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds, kind of hard to go wrong, right?
I know, it was very meta too.
Well, yeah, and it starts off as if it was made for us. I mean, the opening quote, Hayley, is I think Ryan Reynolds, or I should say Will Ferrell, doing a voiceover, and he's basically saying, "Do people change? Like, do people make real, lasting change?" As the ghost of Christmas yet to come is pointing at a woman who they've helped change and her grave,
who is Rose Byrne, who is like wonderful.
Yes. Yeah, it's I will say, as like a creative idea, I mean, the idea that they helped Ebenezer Scrooge and then it was like so successful that they just kept on doing it for the next couple hundred years is like a really fun idea.
Yeah.
And where they took this story was really interesting because they create this reality and then through it are dealing with some pretty real questions. Are people capable of changing? Is it possible to be irredeemable? Like a very heavy word that, I think people that you and I work with maybe have wrestled with themselves.
Yeah.
So maybe we should start a conversation today about Ryan Reynolds' character, who's the modern Scrooge, as it were. Will Ferrell's The Ghost of Christmas Present sort of zeroes in on this guy because he is, someone who Will Ferrell's character sees as having a better chance at creating more ripples. Like if we can only help this guy, imagine the positive ripples that will come out.
It'll help more people overall.
Because, he's got a very wide-ranging job and he influences a lot of people. And prior to that, it looked like the team was going to pick this sort of very stereotypical Scrooge type, like a manager of a hotel who's just like an obviously terrible person.
Yeah, just like super bossy and mean.
Yeah, well, which is so interesting because, when you compare the Ryan Reynolds character to this character we only see for a couple minutes, how are they that much more redeemable or irredeemable? I don't know. It's such an interesting label to use.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, I think like what they're understanding about it was that like Clint Briggs, so Ryan Reynolds' character was like, yeah, I'm a bad guy. Great. Move on. Almost like this dedication to evil rather than just naturally evil.
Right. And I guess the implication of the like course of treatment, which is sort of like a fun way to think about the ghosts of past and present and Christmas yet to come. Like as soon as he's sort of like, yeah, I get what you're about to do. You can show me all the terrible things. This is who I am. I'm not going to be any different. I guess that's their perspective on like someone who's in a way like treatment resistant, perhaps immune to whatever they think they can show him that's going to help him change who he is. So it's interesting in that they kind of set him up as a person who, it doesn't matter what insight you share with him, he's accepting of being this kind of person.
Yeah. And like attached to it
almost. And I think attached to it, like, it's like a part of his identity that he embraces.
Yeah.
We think of the classic Scrooge as being someone who is unaware of the impact he is having on people, that he is very sort of selfish and self-centered, but he is sort of shocked by the negative ripples that he, comes to learn he causes throughout the course of his actions.
Well, yeah, I think the difference is the original Scrooge is shocked that like the person that he was mean to had a bad time, right?
Sure.
Whereas like the Clint Briggs figure, he is aware of that first ripple, but what we come to find out as the like episode progresses or like the movie progresses is that he's not aware of like where that hurt goes after he has released it into the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, in a very sort of classic, similarly Scrooge-like origin story, Clint also has some trauma that he's been through in the classic sort of Christmas, Ghost of Christmas Past process. We see a pretty rough upbringing. No dad, it felt like, was in the picture. Single mom.
Real mean single mom.
Yeah, really unfortunate dynamic that he and his two siblings were having to deal with growing up. And even when Clint revisits some of those experiences, it's just like, like that sucked, but his perspective on it was that actually that was one of the best lessons that he ever learned, was basically like, don't trust anyone. Like, never assume something good's going to happen.
Yeah. And that's just protective reframing, right?
Absolutely.
So it's the thing that people do of, well, I didn't like her anyway. Right. So like it didn't bother me anyway, because it taught me how to X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, yes, you may have learned something great about it, or you may have learned that like that's not actually a person that you really liked. However, you can also be really hurt by that scenario too. It doesn't have to be either or. Yeah.
Yeah, and Clint as a potential client, if you or I were seeing him, feels like the kind of person who would be mandated or like strongly encouraged by a parent or spouse or boss to like, no, you need to do this because this relationship's not working out or whatever it might be.
Yeah. The line the note that I wrote was, this feels like therapy when a person isn't on board. And that explicitly came from like when they start the the journey. And Ryan Reynolds is like, wait a
Mm-hmm.
minute, are you Christmas caroling me? Like, is that what's happening here? And like, what's like, why? What's your thought when it could be anybody else? Why me? Like, of all the people, that very much, I like had this moment of like this one patient that I had that like, no matter what I said, they were like, well, no, here's why that's not correct, or like, here's why that's stupid, or like, no, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, why are you here? Like, what work are we doing if you clearly don't want to be here?
Yeah.
But that's definitely what it felt like. But also in a way where he doesn't leave, which also, like, I don't know how much he could technically, but like, you know,
right.
frequently
He goes along for the ride.
Yeah. But like when the new version of Will Ferrell calls him from the room at the office party, he like goes and finds him rather than ignoring it, right?
Yep.
But that happens, I think, a lot in therapy as well. Is like even people who aren't on board sometimes like keep coming back, and oftentimes it's like a repeated question of like, what are your goals? What are you hoping for? What are your values? Like, what are we doing here? I had that feeling too.
Well, absolutely. You know, it reminded me, you know, when I worked in substance use, obviously we would work with people who were mandated, you know, they didn't want to be in treatment. They didn't want to be in therapy. But they were required to be there by the law for one reason or another. And, you know, you would get very similar thing where it's like, I'm going through my spiel about how treatment's going to work. And, you know, and all they want to talk about is like how the judge screwed them or how the police officer did this or that. And it's basically like, you got the wrong person. Like, I'm not supposed to be here. And even Clinton says that it's like, of all the murderers and people who do gender reveal parties, which is one of my favorite jokes of the movie, you know, you chose me. Like, I don't get it. He doesn't see himself as having so many negative qualities that this sort of course of treatment should be applicable for him. And yet, as he gets to know Will Ferrell's character and as he gets to revisit some of those experiences, he does very much willingly go along for the ride. And it's not so much in the spirit of I want to change, but like almost like a curiosity is what the vibe that I got. Like as soon as he met Will Ferrell's character, yes, it's like, what's this guy's deal? What's he about? And whether that's coming from like, you know, Clint's sort of natural manipulative tendencies or, you know, just sort of some degree of acceptance of like, okay, if I have to deal with these people in this weird night, I might as well play along
with it.
kind of thing.
He definitely seems like somebody who, like, I think it's probably what makes him very successful at his job. But somebody who's like, I'm curious to see where this story goes, or like, I'm curious to see how you're going to spin this. And so I think to me, that's kind of what keeps him along, is like, all right, I'll bite. Like, that's what it feels like.
Yeah. Right. That. And you know, certainly when I have worked with mandated people who have had to come into treatment by law, you know, that's sort of part of the relationship building is like, hey, I know you don't want to be here, but
what are you
presumably
do
you do want to get off probation, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Or presumably you do want to, you know, improve your relationship with your parents, or presumably you do want, there are things that we can kind of align with each other to get through this experience in a way that benefits you.
Yeah.
Because that's sort of what I'm going to call him Roberto, because I think it's funny that Will Ferrell refers to his character that way, that Roberto sort of tries to consistently kind of convince him that no, he needs to experience these memories. He needs to basically do this work. And it was and we described it as meta before, because unlike the original Christmas Carol, because Roberto is like naming the process that Clint is supposed to be experiencing. It's like, no, this is your trigger moment, or this is your, you know, revealing, you know, this is the part where you're supposed to get the understanding of how you became this person. And I wanted to ask you, because as a therapist, you know, obviously we can also be meta. We can also name the experience of what's happening in the room.
Yeah.
Is that something that you do, or what are your thoughts on sort of like Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a super meta therapist. I think what also adds to the meta-ness of this movie is that Ryan Reynolds has seen A Christmas Carol. And so he's like,
of course, right. So he knows.
wait, hold on. Is it like, right? So it's even more meta. Like he already knows what's happening. And then
yes,
Roberto or Will Ferrell, he's like even further describing it. But yeah, I'm an explicitly meta therapist in that in my first like consult phone call that I have with people, the like 15-minute one to see that we're a good fit, I explain to them what ACT is and the process of how I do therapy. I explain that in that first meeting and I'm like, this is how I do it. How does that sound? Do you feel on board? Partly because I think like there are such different types of how therapy can be done that different people are actually looking for different processes. So like if you're somebody who just like wants to come in and have somebody kind of like acknowledge that what you're going through is hard and kind of that's it, I'm not the therapist for you in that regard. However, there's plenty of people who are. Or if you're somebody who wants to come in and you have like this very specific goal of like, I want to learn these very specific skills and I want to change my thoughts and I want to get rid of my irrational whatever. I'm also not that therapist because I'm not a very like explicit skill set based therapist. And so like I always explain, I also then like sometimes I'll do therapy and then at the end or later or a few weeks past or whatever else, well, here's why I ask that question. And I kind of explain like, this is how this applies to your therapy.
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously to your point here, there are very structured versions of therapy. I'm thinking like EMDR, for example, where we would name and we would even say, similar to what Roberto, or maybe we should call him Ebenezer. I mean, that's who he actually is, right? With Scrooge literally does, where he's recalling up certain memories. Like, okay, can you bring up XYZ? And we go there.
Like CP is like Christmas present.
Yeah. And there are therapeutic approaches where it's like, okay, last time we left off on this memory and this feeling or this experience, let's go back there. Let's reorient ourselves to that experience and pick up where we left off. And that sort of high degree of structure and sort of meta naming the process has been shown to be helpful in some circumstances, and certainly for people who are comfortable working in that context, it can be really powerful.
Yeah. Well, and I also think like sometimes explicitly is particularly in like trauma work or like work where you are stepping into a hard space. I think it can be really helpful to like kind of give them a heads up of, hey, I have a question. I'm curious about when your sister died. Do you mind if I explore that with you a little bit? Right?
Yep.
Sometimes a heads up is kind of needed rather than just being like, so your sister died, huh? That can be jarring in a way that can be untherapeutic, or which is what happens in this movie, right? So they throw the sister dying like scene on him and he's like, whoa, no, and he literally runs.
Yes, he does.
And then later Will Ferrell's kind of like, okay, I think we should go back and revisit a scene, and Ryan Reynolds is like, okay, and Will Ferrell's like, stay with me, like I'm here, don't worry, don't run. And that's a little bit like more, I think, kind of a therapy way.
Yeah, and obviously Will Ferrell's character is going through some of his own stuff during the course of this experience, both because he's reminded of his own experience of being quote unquote unredeemable because he is Scrooge, but also because he is at the onset of the movie being sort of like gently encouraged to go into retirement, which for Ghosts of Christmas Present means becoming a human again for some period of time. And he's sort of resistant to that, which I thought was just like a really interesting wrinkle, because they acknowledged in the course of the movie that he didn't live very long after
it was like 3 weeks
after having visits from the various ghosts and learning his lesson and changing who he was. He lived 3 weeks after this experience, and he didn't get to really see the
Test it.
fruits of his change and his labor. Yeah. So there's something kind of sad and tragic about that.
That was a really funny joke where he said, like, the leading cause of death back then was January.
Yes.
I was like, oh my gosh, that's so funny.
Yes. Yeah. And, acknowledging throughout the course of the movie that this person did want to be a person again. Given the opportunity, he wanted to love, and he wanted to experience indoor plumbing, and he wanted to have a bro. Like, I think kind of visiting all these people's lives, on some level made him kind of yearn for this, even if he didn't name that desire out loud.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, I think this comes up in almost everything we do, I feel. And I think it's because it's the most human thing, being held back by comfort and fear. So he's good at this job, and he feels good doing it because it is like, he likes changing people. He has liked changing people. He feels good about changing people. It has served him. It has functioned really well for so long. However, it's now at a point where, like, it no longer serves him in a fulfilling way, in the way that, like, his desire to have a partner would. And I think that happens to us as people a lot, as we get kind of stuck in, like, the thing that we're doing, and we're like, well, it's good enough, without checking in with ourselves of, like, well, it's been good enough for, in his case, like, hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But is it still good enough? Right? Like, is it still fulfilling? Is it still meaningful? Or is it time for you to readjust your valued actions? Which ultimately it is.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you said that when we were talking about doing this movie, like, oh, this is therapy. And if we treated Ebenezer as therapist, certainly we would recognize signs of maybe therapists maybe dealing with something like burnout, or a therapist maybe dealing with something like transference or countertransference, where there's things going on that are interfering with the work being done in the way it's supposed to be done. That's why I found myself sort of being interested in that process being reinforced when Jacob Marley kind of catches them visiting Ebenezer's past, right? And it's like, well, it's like, no, I just thought, I could show him this, and then that would help him understand, that he could change too. And I think realistically, when as therapists, we do try to, for example, use tools like self-disclosure and things like that, where, we might decide how much of our own experience to share with a patient for their benefit. But it's a slippery slope. And that's why it's, when therapists are in training and in school, like, that's a big topic of, like, hey, this is a tool, but it's also something that we want to be very conscious of when we use it.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that are identified there in a therapy relationship. One is self-disclosure. How much do you tell? When do you tell it? Are you telling it because it's something to do with you, or are you telling it because it has something that will be therapeutically beneficial for your patient? But the other part that pops up is also the importance for therapists to be aware of their own stuff and their own psychology. And it seems as though in this, like, a lot of stuff is coming up for Scrooge about, like, his feelings about what it meant to be unredeemable, and how, like, how much joy he has experienced from change, and, like, the way that it's served him. And he then is placing his value set on Clint, right? So, for example, there's one episode or one section where he, like, starts describing, like, look, this is what your life would have been with Nora and children and whatever. And Clint goes, I think this is the life that you want for yourself. And then it turns out, like, yes, that is the life that Scrooge wants with Kimberly, Octavia Spencer's character. And that's something that I'm, like, incredibly thoughtful about in ACT therapy, which is, when are therapists putting their values on their patient, right? So, like, if you think that it's important for I'm going to pick something that people think they can have an opinion about, whether a woman wants to have children or not, right? Like, just because you might think that that's important does not mean that your patient thinks it's important. And, like, that can be really hard.
It can.
especially when it's like things that feel like explicitly, a great example. This came up all the time when I worked with young adults on the autism spectrum. Their parents always want them to like have a social life in a very kind of like specific way. And
traditional, sure.
Yeah. And some of my patients really wanted that, right? Others were like, I don't really like hanging out with people, and I don't really like, I talk to my friends online, and that's kind of, I'm good with that. Like my emotional social needs are met in that regard. And what was happening in those moments was these parents were putting their like what they value on their child, and their child was like, I don't really value that. And therapists can do that as well, particularly I think in that same example. It's like a lot of therapists are like, well, let's teach you how to make friends, and they're like, I don't want to make friends.
Yeah, or even the ways of making friends that we would assume are comfortable or normal or traditional, I mean, changes fast. I mean, I can say, as someone who's been a therapist for a little while now, talking to younger people about online dating is a little terrifying, because it's not something that I ever had to deal with. And it's like the clearest example of something that's changed that I don't have any like touchstone experience with. So anytime people are talking about that, or like the struggles with it, or approaches to it, I have to kind of, and like therapists do this in general, but just like take that step back and be like, I just don't know enough about what this experience is like. So I can't even make assumptions that are based in the experiences that you're having dealing with this that are helpful for you.
Ryan, you need to find a single friend who is doing the dating thing and just swipe for him or her a little bit.
Oh my God, that sounds terrifying.
Well, I think like another like way that it comes up in like not romantic relationships is, I like asked my mom, how did people make friends or meet partners when you were my age? Because I think these days, although I am making an observation, and I don't know if it's the age that I'm at or what, but it seems to me that more and more of my patients are moving away from apps again and like meeting people in person more and more, which maybe, but like, I think because the apps are available, meeting somebody at a sports club, or meeting somebody in the bar, or like meeting somebody in the wild like that doesn't happen as much. I think the one that does kind of continue to happen is meeting through friends.
Of course.
But because the apps are available, like people aren't approaching people in bars because they don't have to. They get to go home and lie in bed and swipe through 60 women or 60 men or whatever.
That's right.
Whereas there would only be one at a bar. And I do think that you're right. Like, things change so quickly that like your thoughts about it may not be their thoughts about it.
Yeah. And it becomes really important in that dynamic to kind of let that person lead. I mean, Ebenezer as a ghost of Christmas Present, is experiencing Clint's memories with him. And as he's doing that, is naming like, oh my gosh, this is such an important memory. And of course, Clint is inclined to like run away from it. And I think, it's so interesting, because when you have a rigid, and again, I'm just going to keep kind of referring to this as like a treatment process, or as like a, protocol, because that's what it is. It's like, it's like past, present, future, and then yet to come. And then he points at the grave, and then either the person becomes a better person or they don't. Like, that is the course of treatment. And when I think when a course of treatment is that rigid, when someone is resistant to that, it can really like throw a wrench into, well, what now? Well, it's like, if we were doing this and now you don't want to do that anymore, now what happens? And we kind of see how Ebenezer responds to that, which is basically he has his own kind of breakdown and ends up accepting retirement and then becoming a real boy, a real old man again.
He's like, I'm going to shower once a month, New York.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah, and then it becomes a very different dynamic, right? And I said before we started recording that it then sort of, in some ways, felt like it took on this sponsor-sponsee relationship where it's like, oh, we're both learning, or we're both in this process together.
Yeah, that idea that you said before we started, where you said it feels like a sponsor-sponsee relationship because Scrooge was an unredeemable. Like, I've been through this redemption journey. That very much feels like a sponsor-sponsee kind of like message. Like, I have explicitly been on this journey so I can lead you through it. Whereas like therapists, the journey is more like, I don't have to be on the journey because it's your journey. I'm just here to help you through it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the sponsor-sponsee dynamic, and for people who don't, know anything about what that is, in Anonymous, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all sorts of groups like that, sort of community support type groups, 12-step groups in particular, sponsors are people who have been through the steps in this case and are ready now as part of that process to then help other people go through that process. And, in the case of Alcoholics Anonymous, maintain sobriety. So in this case, it is similar because Ebenezer was unredeemable, was redeemed, is helping other people through that experience. And I think it's particularly, and having worked with people who have gone through AA, I think there very much is this sort of transference experience where it's like, oh, if I see someone in the rooms who reminds me of that younger version of me, like it becomes something where it's like, I got to talk to that guy.
Yeah.
I have to share my story. I have to share my experience, or girl or woman or whoever.
Yeah.
But that becomes a really powerful part of the sponsor's ongoing recovery, because it's like, this helps me reinforce the work that I've done to get to where I am by, helping you kind of achieve those same results.
Well,
so
it's explicitly
powerful
kind
stuff.
Of taught in that process, isn't it? It's like part of your process is then passing it on to the next generation of variety. Yeah.
And similar to people when they're going through that 12-step program, relapse and ongoing struggles is another part of that experience. And we see Ebenezer, especially as he's reborn, retired into the world, a real person again, starts to experience the sort of ups and downs of what it's like being a person again. And even though he has a great night, as he says, with
Kimberly?
Name Kimberly, yes. Octavia Spencer's character is Kimberly. She's like the executive VP to Clint's business. He has a great night, but then he, despite having that great night with Kimberly, just sort of is still despondent about it. Like, doesn't feel like it's going to go well, doesn't feel like he did good enough. And I think when people have had enough negative experiences, whether it's things like relapses or re-traumatizations, it can be very easy to kind of fall into that sense of helplessness of just like, it's, I'm just going to keep ending up here. It doesn't matter. And I think, Clint very similarly is like, this is who I am. It sort of becomes part of the identity, even when they don't want it to be. There's like a over identification or like an acceptance that's unhealthy in a way. It's like
the over identification with like, this is the person that I am.
Yes. Because I think, and recovery, using that, sticking with that metaphor, it's like, I'm just a person who drinks. And it's like, okay, well, you're a person who has been a drinker or has experienced these difficulties.
Chooses to drink repeatedly.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think that
and that brings us back to choice, which is exactly where they go with this movie as well.
Yeah, and I think that also is that question of like, can people change? Is anybody unredeemable? And my thing is like, well, it depends. Do they want to redeem themselves? And I think that's kind of what it comes down to is, so the second question I asked was like, can people change? And they said, yes, we are therapists. Because if you and I didn't believe that people could change, we wouldn't be in the job. Like it wouldn't, like our whole job is to like help people wanting to change, facilitate that change for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like Ryan Reynolds' character, again, it becomes this. So there's this thing, whereas like if we as people give up our power, so we kind of like, well, I'm a drinker, like I can't do anything about it. We don't have to take responsibility for it, right? Like
that's right.
The universe or our biology or something gets to be to blame. But what we also do in that moment is we undermine our ability to play an active role in our lives as well. So we give away positive power as well. And I think that like what I often notice is like a lot of my work is start taking responsibility for your choices. Like start acknowledging that you are choosing to brush your teeth. You're choosing to go to the bathroom. You're choosing to drink. You're choosing to hug your daughter. You're choosing to reach out.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's people are like super on board with that when it's like something that they like that they've done, right? Like they're like, yep, I followed my medical regimen exactly. Like I chose that. I did it. Good for me. When they don't do it, they're like, well, I wanted to, but, and then they like give their power away to like some force.
Yeah. And Clint kind of does that at the climax of this movie where he kind of writes off correcting his quote unquote one bad decision as like, yeah, no, I just fixed that thing, but I'm going to go back to work next week and I'm going to keep doing all those things. And he even, I think one of the sort of greatest displays of that sort of level of self-awareness, while also being stuck in a certain degree of helplessness, is he's like, and I'm just going to rationalize all these things I do again. I'm going to be that same person. I'm going to keep doing these things. And yeah, I made this one better decision, but I think this is kind of just who I am. And what I felt watching that moment is a little bit of fear on Clint's part that if I am a better person, then I can't return to that safety of rationalization as easily anymore.
Yeah, it's harder.
Then I have to deal with that pressure of actually changing and making these decisions on a consistent basis.
Well, okay, so that's also what I find happens with my patients all the time is they feel like, well, if I make one change, I may have to make 1,000 changes.
Sure.
And so like the final or like the song right before Clint gets hit by the bus, the like main theme of it is that like a little is enough. And I think that like, I love that song because I was like, yes, change starts with a tiny step. However, I think if we also pair that with Clint saying like, well, it's just one change, I'm not going to change any of the rest of them. Both of these are true. So like if you do one good thing once, yes, that's one more than you would have done otherwise. Or let me say one valued thing once. That's one more than you would have done before. However, if you don't do it again or like repeatedly or consistently, then it becomes something that you did one time. It doesn't become how you live your life, right? So if you...
who you are, yeah.
If you planted a plant once and it died, you can't, I mean, you can say whatever you want, but to say like, sure. Oh, I am a gardener. Okay, yeah, I guess you are a gardener because you have gardened. However, like, are you actively a gardener or did you garden once? And if you garden once, you're more of a gardener than you would be if you hadn't gardened at all, right? And so I think like really combining those two things of like, yeah, if you want to be a gardener, that does require gardening. However, you also get to decide like, maybe I do it once and I never do it again. You get to decide that. And if it's something that you want in your life, then logic would suggest that it's something that you would want to do repeatedly. And therefore it starts with one step.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, celebrating that one step, I think is something that I emphasize in therapy. I think,
because it's more than it wasn't.
Yeah. And not only that, but I think we have a tendency to minimize doing the thing we think we're supposed to do. Right. So if it's like, big deal. Like I woke up and went to the gym this morning. Like that's what a healthy person is supposed to do. And it's like, okay, that can be true. That maybe that's standard definition of a person that takes care of themselves. But that's also something that you were not doing for this long period of time for all these different reasons. So it is significant that you went from not doing it to doing it. And I do want to celebrate it no matter how uncomfortable that makes you, person that wants to minimize this change.
Truly. And I almost go even like more extreme than that sometimes, where like my patients will kind of be like, well, I didn't really achieve anything. And I was like, you woke up and you got dressed and you went to work and you breathed the whole day and you greeted another person and you came home and had made money for yourself and you had dinner and then you got into bed and got rest. Like you kind of nailed it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if they like didn't have a full day like that, like they got up and they went and like poured themselves a glass of water and then got back into bed. Yesterday, you didn't hydrate at all. Nailed it.
Right.
Like, yeah, that's what a healthy person's supposed to do. And you did it. You did a healthy person thing, nailing it. Right. It's all about like the action. Yes. Do what it is that you want to be. If you want to be a healthy person, do the healthy person thing. Maybe that means having a glass of water. Maybe that means going to the gym. Maybe that means calling your mom, like whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, if therapists were to rewrite the Christmas Carol, would we want the ghost of Christmas yet to come to be like the hand of death and here's what bad stuff is going to happen if you don't change your ways? Or would we want it to be Christmases that are yet to come? Here's how amazing your life could be if you make this change when you wake up tomorrow.
Ooh, I don't really like either of those.
No, I know, but like if that's the spectrum and being faced with a future has value, where because I think very naturally, when we're working with people, especially people with anxiety, it's just like, oh, if I just knew what was going to happen, this year, like I could just put my head down and do those things. It's like, okay, knowing what the future would be would make it a lot easier for you to do quote unquote the right thing or make some of these changes we're talking about. But, in the same way that knowing the negative consequences of your actions doesn't totally motivate you to change them, like knowing the supposed benefits of doing the right thing also is not just like automatically motivating.
No, certainly not.
The future part is always a fascinating part of this like story to me.
Well, so I'll give you an example. So I have a patient who has OCD and they explicitly will be like, yeah, I am aware how my life will be different if I am no longer engaging in my compulsions. Yeah, I get it.
Yep.
So if Ghost of Christmas Future were to be like, this is how your life would look without compulsions, they're like, yeah, no-ish, Sherlock.
No kidding.
Like,
yeah.
I know, I've thought about it, right?
Yeah.
And on the other side, like if you said to them, like, this is what your life looks like if you don't give up your compulsions, they're like, yeah, no, I know what hole I'm digging myself. Right?
I'm already there.
Yeah. So I think like it really kind of depends on where the person is at, what it can be. So I think for the Scrooges and the Clints, their characters are not aware of the consequences of their behavior. And so for them, it's chosen of like, this is what you're doing. This is the consequence of your behavior. There are patients who like don't believe that goodness can happen. So they're like, why would I bother to change? Right. And so them, you would kind of want to be like, well, look, this is what could happen. And frequently I'll have patients who will be like, well, what if, and then they'll tell like, the worst example. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's probably what's going to happen. And they're like, Hayley. And I'm like,
oh, what?
And then I'm like, oh, okay. Is that not where our brain is going? They're like, no, that is where my brain is going. And I'm like, okay, well, where do you want your brain to go? And they'll be like, well, I want you to be like, well, no, maybe. And then they like tell the positive version of it. And I go, yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. They're always like super annoyed with me when I do that. And I'm like, point one, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Point two, it could turn out one of these ways. And you just got to figure out your best. So I think like if I were a therapist choosing, it would totally depend on like the person. Like, is this a person who needs to be reminded that good can happen? And what kind of good can happen? For example, like the OCD patients, they often get caught up in it's going to be this way forever. And what's the point? And so like they recognize like, yeah, I understand what you say can happen, but like, I don't believe that can actually happen. For them, really kind of like encouraging exploring future and like hoping a little bit, dreaming a little bit, can be really meaningful. For other patients, particularly like self-centered or anxiety-based patients, it's let's back up on the dreaming a little bit and start thinking about like what do we actually have control over, or like what are the consequences of our actions.
Because I think the idea that and I like the running joke of Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come just points and and it's like there's something interesting there where so Ghost of Christmas Future, and it's like, okay, so as a social worker, we have this very stereotypical tool called the miracle question, right? Where it's the whole idea is, imagine a world in which you woke up tomorrow and a miracle has happened. How would you know the miracle had happened? What would be different? What would you notice? What would be different in your interactions? And that's sort of what I was picturing in this sort of like, what would the opposite of scary death version of Christmas Yet to Come be like? Because that's we do when we ask that question to sort of do exactly what scary version is doing, which is to like, let's find the hope, let's find the energy, let's find the motivation. Oh, if this is something that we're trying to envision, this miracle being possible, there are details that are within your control that you can then enact in your actual life, you know, to create conditions around, as if this miracle had happened anyway.
So the act-based version of the miracle question is, if your life was the way that you wanted it to be, what would you be doing, right? And there's emphasis on that action, right? What would you be doing that you're not doing now? And really emphasis on like, you're the person taking action in this scenario. And then are like, well, if your perfect life includes you reading every day, what's keeping you from reading every day? And is that worth it? Right. Or what are you doing now that's in the direction of you one day living a life where you read it?
Yeah, and where those questions are not necessarily useful is with people like Scrooge, who it's like, what are you talking about? I was doing just fine. Can I just go back to living my life the way that it was? And that's where this sort of dynamic breaks down a little bit, because if someone is coming to you, it's because they want their life to be different, presumably to some degree than it is now. And the Scrooges and Clints are not having that necessarily that desire until they are faced with like a very specific negative outcome. In Clint's case, he's given this sort of advice to his niece and unintended consequences, really actually dark unintended consequences. This movie started as something that I would watch with my 7-year-old, and it got to a place that I'm not sure if I want to.
But that one was so euphemistic that she probably wouldn't even understand what happened.
You're right. They don't actually name it.
Yeah. Like the closest they get is, why would he do something like that? Was all they said.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Well, and my biggest issue with this movie is that poor niece. First, she loses her mom, and then she has this weird interaction with her uncle, and then he gets hit by a bus.
Yep.
The trauma of that poor girl, and they just blow right past it. And it's all because the only reason he was there was because of her presidency run. You don't think she's carrying that with her forward? Oh my goodness.
Right. And why, it's okay. So Clint dies, and then Jacob basically tells him, your sacrifice wouldn't
have mattered if you hadn't died.
Be valuable if it didn't have consequences. Right. And that's coming from a very puritanical mindset, where it's if you're not punished, or if you don't if there's what valued But then it's some of that's taken away if he's still able to visit Ebenezer, and he's able to visit
Kimberly.
But why do we not see him visiting his niece is my whole question. It's like, if he's got visiting powers, there's someone out there who would most benefit from this, not Ebenezer's 2 kids that he's had since you became the new ghost of Christmas present.
I know, it's very confusing. It almost seems like there's something about that family that can see the ghosts rather than like whatever. But
I guess
I think it does seem like Will Ferrell is maybe like invested with his niece a little bit, because he was like, did you see that Ren got into the Stanford Masters?
That's true. So he's, so they tried to cover it up for a little bit where it's like he's following along with her.
But my brain also was like, they had to throw in that she was going to Stanford for a master's because, like, look, she turned out fine. Which, like, I'm sorry.
She's okay. Everybody, don't worry about her.
Somebody can succeed academically and still have a lot of stuff going on because their mom and uncle both died tragically. Oh, poor girl. Mm-hmm. My goodness. That's not
I know.
I also think this idea, I think there's a song called Forever Unredeemable, which I think was Will Ferrell's song. Mm-hmm. And I think that really resonated with this idea of negative self-talk. Like, we have these statements about ourselves, like, I'm forever unredeemable, I'm a bad person, I'm awkward, I'm like, people don't like me. Like, we have these negative narratives that, like, we let be the truth rather than recognizing that they're just a dream or just a song in our head or just a narrative in our head. And then we use them to hold us back from, like, making those explicit changes.
Yeah. It's, they do a lot, between the songs and the morals and this, the stuff that they're trying to pull from it. It was a lot. It's overstuffed. It's chock full of, lessons and takeaways and spirits. So it's, look, it's got substance. It does have it asks some really interesting questions, and it tries to answer those questions in really interesting, unique ways. And it certainly gives us some models for almost like, we mentioned we made this sort of sponsor-sponsee comparison, but I also found myself doing research on, have you heard of mutual aid therapy?
No.
Okay, so it doesn't seem to be like super popular out in the world, but it is something that exists, and it seems to be described in a way in which I'm just going to read you from what I found while I was doing this research. It relies on the power of small groups or peers to support the individual as they gain confidence in their ability to use essentially various coping skills. But the members partaking in this mutual aid therapy, there is constant fluidity between the roles of like consoled and counselor. So I had to ask you what you think about this model, because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because I also, and this is going to be like a long walk to get to this point, but I read an article recently. There's certainly countries, especially in Africa, was this story, I think it was in the New York Times recently, where they acknowledged just the crazy shortage of therapists and like psychologists and psychiatrists in certain, particularly African countries, where it's like something like 35 psychiatrists for, 2 million people or whatever. So this concept of mutual aid or social aid or like village elders sort of doing some of these roles like as therapists, I think is a really interesting one. And obviously I think you and I would have concerns or caution about exactly how some of these dynamics would play out. But I guess in general, how does this idea strike you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. I just think it's not therapy. So
okay, right. So that's a good clarification. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that like support groups and like men's groups, particularly, you don't frequently have like women's groups, but like there's a lot of like support groups,
like frameworks,
that like happen. And I'm also thinking like if you have a friend group that's all just like very supportive of each other and very open and very vulnerable, like this is what happens, right? Is like some days
absolutely.
it's your turn to be sad and consoled, and other days it's my turn to be sad and consoled. I think in the difference between friendships and these types of groups is I think that there's like an explicit, like now, like who's holding the conch, basically, like whose turn is it
absolutely.
to talk? But I think the benefit, well, first of all, you speaking about them being very popular in Africa, African culture, there's a lot more collaboration and like tribal collectivism that happens in African culture. And so I think that almost feels as though like the level of respect and like honor of each other would be a reason why that would work explicitly better there than it does here in the United States.
Yeah.
And I think that like one of the things that really works about therapy is this like explicit difference between friendship and support group and therapist. And I think that they each have a really cool role to play, just as long as you're like, it's not, you recognize it's not the same thing. It's like a coach and a therapist. Like I send some of my teenagers who have ADHD to ADHD coaches. I'm like, I'm not going to sit with you and create a plan of how to do this. However, there is somebody that will. And if one of us did the other one's job, it like wouldn't work very well. So it's better if you have me one week at them another week and just kind of like use them. Find what works for you. I think that's what it comes down to. Find what works for you.
Well, yeah. And you know, I think part of the reason I was interested in this concept is because certainly there are gaps that need to be filled, you know, whether it's because you don't have that sort of friend group or because you don't have insurance, you don't have access to therapists or, you know, all these different circumstances. And that's why things like AA and sponsor-sponsee relationships have a lot of benefit. That's why coaches have benefit. Why community organizations and support groups and village elders and all these different types of relationships can serve really important roles while also not explicitly being therapy. So so just I think it's important for people to know that there is a ton of different stuff out there. You know, it often requires a little bit of research and kind of digging around, but you can find stuff if you're willing to look.
I agree.
So why don't we I was gonna say, why don't we put a nice little Christmas bow on this?
I love it. So my scale for you, Ryan, is my favorite moment in the whole movie. So on a scale from 0 to 5, Will Ferrell's pointing at the man in the elf costume and saying, "You look stupid." How accurate do you feel like this portrayed therapy or mental health or the human experience?
Okay, so it's really hard for me to give such a fantastical, fictional, meta Christmas story any good rating of something that's based in reality. Even the characters are sort of like tropes in their own way. Like he's a modern Scrooge. Like he's a guy, right? That being said, I will try to give it some credit on, let's say, the change process and some representation on some of the struggles that people experience in navigating some of that. So let's say it is, I'll try to be like a generous 2.2 out of 5 for accuracy.
Wow. It's not often that you rate lower than me.
Okay, so you were going to give it, you would have given a more generous accuracy rating?
I'm like 3.2 to 3.5-ish.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. It's just like, for me, it's like, you know, we're dealing with, you know, spirits and all these things that are so removed from reality that it's hard for me to distill that down to what real stuff needs to be taken from it. But for sure, there's really useful like interpersonal dynamics and lessons that I think are based in reality and those sorts of relationships.
That I think is kind of important is what it really illustrates is that like growth is not linear and change is not linear. And I think that's also really important, is to recognize that like you can do this for a bit and then not do it for a while and then do it again and then not, right? And I think that was something that was like really
Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. So, Hayley, before I ask you your entertaining question, I feel compelled to maintain our like popularity ratings guessing game.
Okay.
So, what do you think Spirited did in terms of Rotten Tomatoes?
And it's 100?
104 out of a scale of 100.
Okay.
Yes.
I think like 83.
Pretty good guess. So out of 104 critics reviews, 70% is the score it got.
That wasn't good at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a solid C.
Oh, what's the
not
audience rating? That's what I'm more going by.
So it looks like the oops.
Because I understand why critics rated it less.
Yeah. It looks like it was like a 6.4. So it looks like actually slightly lower.
Oh.
But I'm going to confirm that as I'm talking.
Because it didn't need to be a musical.
Yeah. So that was one of the criticisms, is that it's literally like overstuffed with so much. Like they tried to do so much with it. Oh, there you go. Audience score. What did you what rating did you guess?
83.
Audience score of 82.
I am so good at guessing the audience score.
You're very good at this guessing game.
I love this game.
And the tomato meter was 69. Yeah. We're going to keep playing it as long as you keep killing it.
That.
So, okay, but that brings us to your view. So on a scale of 1 to 5 good afternoons.
Oh, no. How dare you?
Like, what if that, I think that was my funniest running joke was was funny. Like the idea of an old-timey saying, just like having this crazy different context. How entertaining did you find Spirited?
So I have what I think it would have been for me had I not been watching it for this, and then what it was for me. So what it was for me was probably like a 3.2-ish.
Okay.
Like it was like, yeah, that was slightly better than fine.
Yeah, fluffy,
however,
light. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's really nice about Christmas movies is that you don't overthink them. And you and I explicitly overthink movies for this show, right?
We sure do. That's our job, yes.
So this movie, I think like if I took out watching it to like tease it apart and like watching it to like explore the pieces of it and like what do I think is good about this? What do I think is bad about this? I think I would have enjoyed my blanket and my hot chocolate, and I would have watched it and I would have giggled at Will Ferrell pointing to the Buddy the Elf costume and saying, "You look stupid." Like I think I would have, plus like Ryan Reynolds is hilarious. He's always so funny.
Very enjoyable. Yes, absolutely.
And like that scene where he's like, "Are we doing a Christmas Carol? Is that what's happening here?" I think I would have loved that scene if I wasn't like, oh, this feels like someone who's resistant to therapy. And so I think if I had watched it simply for being a Christmas movie, it probably would have been like a 4.2. Like, I think it would have been like a whole point higher because
like Saturday night before Christmas, just throwing it on. Yeah.
I think it's fun. It's stupid. It's real dumb. And it's like, but it's really fun. It feels like Deadpool Christmas.
A little bit. Yes.
Yeah. Which I was like, that's fun.
Yeah. And there's a place for that. Yeah. I mean, we started out talking about our own favorite Christmas things, and a lot of them are just stupid and silly. And, my daughter makes fun of how many times the bad guys from Home Alone should have died. Like she's on that level with us of like he would be dead.
Maybe next year for Halloween, she can be Kevin McAllister and you and your wife can be the two guys who try to break into the house.
I would have to be Marv. That would be fun.
Yeah. Somebody can, get an
iron outline
like burn on their face.
Yes.
That's funny.
All right, Hayley. Well, happy holidays, to you and to all of our listeners. Thank you all for listening this holiday season and this year. And we will come back to you in the new year in 2023 with lots of more fun things to talk about.
Yay! Bye.
Bye.